Hello everyone, welcome to Nature Talks. Sorry for our short delay there. These are our conversations every Tuesday in July with nature's champions and defenders, and it launches our programme for Fixing the Future 2021, which culminates in our festival in Barcelona on the 10th and 11th of December. This event series is organised by Atlas of the Future with the support of the Government of Catalonia. Atlas of the Future is an online resource of hope dedicated to profiling people and projects working for better futures all around the world. It felt vital for us to launch by thinking about how we coexist with and protect all living species. Biodiversity loss and the impact of the climate crisis across the natural world is intricately linked to our own futures and that of future generations. So how can we heal and restore our planet? How are we going to be guided by care and compassion and not plunder and profit? Can we move from systems of extraction to systems of regeneration? How might we change our relationships with the plants, animals, insects, and marine life with whom we share this extraordinary and unique planet of ours? Before I introduce our host for today, just a few practical points. So you're watching us in our streaming room, and later you can access this talk, a recording of this talk on our YouTube channel. We're broadcasting live in English. We have simultaneous translation into Catalan. If you found yourself in the wrong language channel, you should have a button that says language below the video screen, and you can switch channel there. At the bottom of your screen on the right, you have the chat icon, and you can open that, and that's where you can put your comments and chats. For today, we have a moderator in each language in our chat channels, and you can ask them any questions about the event. So in terms of format, after these introductions, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Christine Smith-Martin, followed by a conversation between Christine and our moderator, Josep Maria, and then there's going to be time for them to respond to questions from you all. So please add your questions into chat at any point. Any questions that we can't pick up within the session, our speakers will try to respond to in the chat straight after the session ends. And so now to today's event. It's a tradition and an honor every year to open Fixing the Future by listening to an Indigenous leader. But first, let me welcome our host who's going to guide today's session. And we're in the hands of a true expert here today. Dr. Josep Maria Mayarac has worked for more than 30 years as an environmental consultant in protected areas, nature conservation, environmental assessment, and sustainability. He's a steering committee member of the specialist group on cultural and spiritual values of the World Commission on Protected Areas, and he's an honorary member of the Indigenous Community Conserved Areas Consortium. He coordinates the Delos Initiative, which is devoted to promoting the safeguarding of sacred natural sites in technologically developed countries. And he's the author of some 30 books and hundreds of articles on these topics. So as I say, we're in very good hands, and I'd like to hand over to Josep Maria and Christine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you, all of you. And I'd like just to begin with remembering that we are in the midst of the global systemic crisis with very different dimensions, the ecological dimension, the health dimension, the climate dimension, and so on and so forth, all of them interlinked. And in this context, we should acknowledge that the indigenous peoples, the most resilient living cultures, are our older brothers and sisters. We feel very ashamed that they are still marginalized and criminalized in many countries around the world. It has been estimated that 1/4 of the indigenous peoples of the earth have been exterminated during the last 3 centuries, and about half of those who remain are seriously threatened today. However, thousands of indigenous peoples are still thriving on every continent, including Europe, in northern Scandinavia, northern Russia. And according to the United Nations, there are about 400 million indigenous people, but this figure could be I think, twice as much if the definition of indigenous was less restrictive. Globally, there is a direct positive correlation between cultural and natural diversity. Indigenous peoples, which amount about 5% of the contemporary humanity, conserve approximately 90% of the world languages and about 40% of the global biodiversity. So their contribution to the conservation of the biocultural heritage of the earth is enormous. In the last report, International Panel of the Climate Change report of the United Nations, it was measured a global decline of biodiversity that keeps growing, but it was pointed for the first time that indigenous peoples and deeply rooted local communities are those that are better conserving biodiversity globally. That is why recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples, especially territorial rights, is vital to combating climate change and securing our collective future. After many years of debates, the United Nations adopted in 2007 the resolution on the rights of indigenous peoples. However, it's far from being successfully applied. Every year, hundreds of indigenous leaders are imprisoned, deported, exiled, or even killed all over the world to defend their sacred territories against the voraciousness of mining, oil, forestry, agro-livestock industries, which supply our globally interlinked supermarkets, as the report of Global Witness documents every year. So my sincere tribute to all of them, as well as to all the NGOs and other committed people that fight for indigenous peoples and their sacred values, such as the ICCA Consortium, Survival International, and many others. Today, we have the honor to have with us Christine Smith-Martin, who is the Executive Director of the Coastal First Nation Coalition, a coalition of indigenous peoples that have their ancestral territories in what is nowadays British Columbia, in the western province of Canada. Christine is a member of the Haida Nation and the Lax Kw'alaams community. He has been part of many other organizations, and she has a long track record of partnering with conservation groups, as well as national and global advocates working to address climate change, salmon conservation, and also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning from where I'm coming from. It's 9:17. I think we're just beginning our morning as you guys are winding down your day. My traditional name is Hatyela, which means Haida dancer in our Haida language, our dialect. I come from the Yachlanis clan of Haida Gwaii. My English name, as you mentioned, is Christine Smith-Martin. And I'm the Executive Director of Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative. And I'm coming to you from the beautiful Nisga'a traditional territories in which we live, which is my husband's communities. As I mentioned, I'm from the Haida and the Tsimshian Nation here in British Columbia. But before we begin and before we leap into our discussion, I want to take a moment to pause and to send good thoughts to all of our communities across Canada. As you probably heard in the news, we are currently dealing with devastating findings across Canada. We have approximately 1,300 of our dear children that have been found in unmarked graves outside the residential schools. Of the 150 residential schools that we've had here in Canada, 14 of them have been searched with that amount. We have 136 schools left to search. And we know that that number will increase astronomically. So as we pause, a moment of reflection, ceremonies are taking place across Canada, and in fact, across the world, to commemorate these children that we have lost. We have heard these stories. It's not a surprise to us that they are finding these children, our children, because we have heard these stories at the kitchen table as our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles relive that horrific past here in Canada. So I want to take a moment to pause and remember, as these dear children now can take their last part of their journey to be with the ancestors. Thank you for taking that time and the space for our beautiful children. I want to begin by talking about, if we take care of Earth, Earth will take care of us. In many of our communities, these are the two most important life lessons that our parents, our community, our grandparents taught not only me, but all of the children that are being raised in our communities. There are also values that guide the work of coastal First Nations communities for the last 20 years. They are the foundation of which our culture and our communities have been built for the last 14,000 years in our communities. I'd like to show you a short video of our territories and those who steward them. So if we can play the video, that would be wonderful.
We talk about protecting our ecosystems for the future, the land base for the future, and we cannot do that without having an active presence out on the water.
I don't think we can hear it.
This is the north and central coast in Haida Gwaii. These coastal mountains, lush valleys, and interlocking waterways form the largest and most intact temperate rainforest on Earth. For at least 14,000 years, First Nations people have cared for the region's ecosystems and abundant wildlife. Protecting and stewarding the land and sea is a lifelong responsibility passed on from generation to generation.
It's so important to hear past experiences in areas and family stories and histories that come from these special areas.
Good strong engineers have been run a test hole here, and they find out the grain. You know, this is one of the most amazing places in the world for us, because we know that our ancestors stood on this ground. We knew what they were about. We knew what they were doing.
For more than a century, First Nations governance of their own territories has been disrupted or outlawed by colonial governments. And the traditional ecological knowledge that has allowed nations to flourish over thousands of years has been undermined and overlooked. As a result, illegal hunting, fishing, and forestry was rampant, and the mismanagement and unsustainable harvesting of fishery resources have left little return for the indigenous communities that rely on those resources. But all this is changing. First Nations throughout the north and central coast and Haida Gwaii have been taking back their governance role as stewards and managers of their territories.
This has always been our place. Why would we go to someone else and ask them for authority in our own territory? We already have it. We never let it go. We never gave that up. So there's no need to prove it to anyone. We just need to live it.
Oh, those are such beautiful videos every time I watch them. When our leaders established coastal First Nations 20 years ago. It was with the conviction that we reintroduce a conservation-based economy to the central and north coast and Haida Gwaii of British Columbia. Our active and meaningful participation was essential. We believe that people who know best and use and protect biodiversities are the First Nations people who live in these magnificent forest waters for the past 14,000 years. There was never a more important moment for our communities to work together and to collaborate with others to fulfill our ancestral responsibility to take care of the resources for future generations. We are in the time that we must embrace change and work together for change. That was very important for our elders in our communities. Our leaders believe that innovation is the new strategic imperative for coastal First Nations and its communities. We have always adapted to change while first facing adversities. Natural innovators, our ingenuity was born from facing adversities. With our unique understanding of the interconnectedness of systems in nature, community, and family. In fact, the prosperity of survival of our communities has always been dependent upon the efforts in developing new models to create sustainable economies through balance. It's very important to our communities. In the words of one of our community members, Kelly Brown, the Stewardship Director of the Health Chick Nation, take a little, leave a lot. Making change. Our leaders were eager to be a part of real change. They wanted to take a proactive and a different approach. It was very important to them. Relying heavily on our hereditary leaders, knowledge keepers, and elders to guide us as we move towards an economic, self-sufficient, self-determined future. They told us that the recognition of our Aboriginal rights and title was the foundation of the work that we are about to undertake. They shared those very wise words with us. Everything we must do must be guided by that. This is what system shifting looks like to our leaders. They also reminded us that it is our collective responsibility to restore responsible lands, water, and resource management approaches that are both ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable. That was very important to them. Over the years, we have played a leadership role in bringing together a wide range of interests on the coast to address the unsustainable policies and practices that have damaged our environment and devastated our coastal economies and communities. We believe that we are uniquely positioned to work with government, other groups to build a thriving coast. In the past, the balance between economy, and we all have heard this, the balance between economy and environment has always been weighing in the favor of economy, and we've seen this devastating impact. We wanted that to change, and our elders voiced that. They wanted that to change. Our work for the past 2 decades offers some important and valuable lessons on how we can make that positive change. Let me share some of the lessons with you that we learned. Be bold. Making change means taking risks. We created a culture of change for us. This meant moving away from confrontation and frontline action, moving towards planning, partnerships, yet maintaining our rights and title was very important. The initiatives we were involved in were successful because of our unique, compelling vision, our knowledge of our traditional territories with a global conservation model lens. all for the internationally significant area that we call home, which is the Great Bear Rainforest. We work for change in the areas that include ecosystem health, resource access and use, and community well-being. The collective vision inspired not only First Nations, but government, environmental groups, and industry, and harnessed public support to change the status quo. There was a recognition that land and marine use conflicts did exist between communities, corporations, and it was taking place not only in our communities, but all over the world. It was transpiring. This was an opportunity to create a model to solve those conflicts for the rest of the world. It was a compelling aspect of our vision and the work that we wanted to embark on. Our elders told us, be fearless. If we are to save our ecosystem and our communities, we must take risks, and we must work together for the greater value. Reclaiming our power, real change requires real power. We have had many court decisions that have recognized and affirmed our inherent Aboriginal rights and title. These decisions gave us the power to move ahead in our agendas and moving it forward. While the precise meaning of these cases continue to be defined and refined in the courts, our primary impact was to obligate government and corporations to include First Nations people in the decision-making process regarding our own traditional territories. This was huge. When we signed a protocol agreement with the provincial government to resolve the land use plan, it was the first time in history that the BC government signed an agreement to negotiate on a government-to-government basis with the BC's coastal First Nations communities. This new power dynamic meant that First Nations and the BC government became equal participants at the negotiating table. Coastal First Nations knows that logging, tourism, traditional food gathering, and spiritual ceremonies are a part of our future, but they cannot happen in the same place. Since 2002, Coastal First Nations and the government of British Columbia have negotiated government-to-government agreements to decide the future of our coast, the first of its kind in BC to recognize First Nations' role in land use. These strategic land use plans, agreements between each nation and the province allowed our communities to determine what we value most in our territory, establish protected areas that recognize our Aboriginal inherent right, set out and implement new rules for sustainable forest practices, and generate our own source of revenue for our economic well-being. This shift in power that occurred was one of the most crucial elements in achieving successful outcome for the Great Bear Rainforest. Building relationships, people make change, not institutions. In 1985, a Haida elder and youth stood together in Gwaii, Lyle Island, and South Moresby to say no, there will be no longer any logging on their lands. The Haida action at Gwaii over industrial logging took international significance, as we've seen many of our elders being arrested on this line, taking a stand. What was at stake for the Haidas was not just the environmental concerns, but at the core of who they are and where they have lived for thousands of years, the Haida land protectors were regaining control over and the management of their lands and seas. They wanted to restore the economy and allow it to be sustainable. As the war on woods heated up again in British Columbia, it's the same old story once again. Logging and government versus environmentalists, jobs versus trees, and now versus the future. Few, if any, would have predicted individuals or groups from opposing sides would form personal relationships based on understanding. When we look back at the differences that we had with industry, government, and conservation groups, it is amazing that we came together. During the meetings, people began to listen to one another and listen to each other's interests and perspectives rather than simply exchanging demands, which was huge for us, everybody that was in the room. The Great Bear Rainforest agreements were groundbreaking because they formalized a government-to-government relationship, First Nations and BC, and recognized the need to create a new economic opportunity of ecosystem-based management principles, aiming to protect the ecological and cultural areas, while simultaneously striving to improve the cultural, social, and economic well-being of our local communities and First Nations. Today, a new path forward is on display at the Great Bear Rainforest, where landmark agreements reached between First Nations in the North and Central Coast and Haida Gwaii and the provincial government, supported by forestry companies and environmental groups, have helped to put 3 million hectares of coastal temperate rainforest off limits to logging. Without building these new relationships and developing this historic agreement, most of those territories would surely have been cut down. Change is often slower than any of us would have liked, but we know that through this agreement, it is possible. Embracing diversity, building alliances of strange bedfellows. At the outset, all of the parties involved in our initiatives held very different worldviews. Even if we all agreed change needed to happen and change in the status quo, we all held different views. As such, what change would look like. The strange bedfellow approach was powerful when historically polarized groups presented a solution that they can agree upon. Can you imagine that? All three of them getting together and agreeing upon it. Government had no choice but to endorse the work that was done. Environmental groups arrived with the Great Bear Rainforest campaign with similar perspectives as Indigenous people and the lands and the seas. The First Nations have occupied the BC coast for at least 14,000 years, and we have co-evolved with ecosystems around them, held a more integrative view of the natural world. They're carefully managed the abundant natural resources of both land and sea, relying on the knowledge of seasonal cycles to harvest a wide variety of resources without depleting them. The First Nations vision of change thus involved one of the hand gaining control over the territory by asserting their title and rights and addressing poverty by providing jobs and people living in those communities. The forest company held a worldview based on business economics and the utilitarian view of nature, obligated to their shareholders and working within the context of international export markets. They sought to maximize the annual cutting rates, produce efficient and produce profits. Some of the companies also felt a responsibility to provide continuous employment for the communities of all part of the parties. They benefit the most from the status quo. Until their markets were threatened, they had little incentive to change the way they did business within our territories. A critical phase in reaching the agreements involved all three parties listening to one another and seeking the understanding of a unique perspective each brought to the table. Listening to and validating each other's perspective led to a willingness to expand and merge the respective visions of change so that each could see their value and interests reflected in the solutions that are being proposed. It included funds to the community for economic development, but such funds would be applied for conservation management and development of sustainable business. That was very important to ensure that we had that in our agreement. They could not use or promote unsustainable resource extraction. And finally, logging would occur in the region, but it wouldn't be the business as usual. It would involve the lighter touch approach of ecosystem-based management. The strange bedfellows approach was powerful. When government was presented with the solution that had been agreed upon by such a historic polarized groups, they had virtually no choice but to endorse it and to make it work and become a reality. Be smart and more complex entrenched systems. However, the more creative and innovative we must be to make change. Over the past century and a half, we have lost our rightful control over our areas, forcing to attend residential schools, experiencing systemic racism, forced to relocate, experiencing high levels of unemployment in our communities, almost no control over the lands that we use in our territory. While our people have successfully stewarded our lands and waters for thousands of years, we knew we had to adapt to change in the environment that we lived in. Our Guardian Watchman programs, as you've seen earlier in the video, are the eyes and the ears of our nations. They monitor, protect, and restore the cultural and natural resources within their territories. Our watchmen bear a heavy responsibility as they carry out the work that their parents, grandparents, and ancestors did. By providing First Nations leaders with critical information, Guardian Watchmen programs help to ensure that our leaders are making informed decisions and effectively plan, manage, and negotiate agreements that will protect our lands and our waters. However, there is a significant cost to carrying out this important work. We have to be innovative to the funds of our Guardian Watchman programs. First Nations on BC Central Coast, North Coast, and Haida Gwaii have quietly emerged as leaders in the sale of carbon offsets. The Great Bear Forest Carbon Project, Canada's first Indigenous-led carbon offset program and one of the world's largest, offering our communities a potential for a sustainable economy and social development while helping to conserve the large and the most ecological significant temperate rainforest in the world. Offsets are generally generated by the vast amount of carbon stored in the rainforest. Trees breathe in and store greenhouse gases and exhale oxygen for the people to breathe. The Great Bear Rainforest, old growth forests that we slated for industry and logging are now protected and supported from the carbon offset funding. By leaving the forest standing, trees continue to provide clean air benefits, and they generate revenue for local economies through offset sales rather than clear-cutting logging sales. Choosing our future means planning and taking action that will result in the kind of communities that we want to live in and pass on to our children and our grandchildren, like our ancestors did before us. The path that we are taking to create a sustainable conservation-based economy is both strategic and forward-thinking. Coastal First Nations communities are prepared preparing for an unprecedented high-speed internet to come through their communities. We will see opportunities emerging in our communities that simply did not exist 10 years ago. We will tackle the digital divide and even see Coastal First Nations leapfrog into creating new, unimaginable digital futures. This includes our world-renowned science, research, and stewardship initiatives, Guardian Watchman programs, world-leading carbon credit offset initiatives, language, culture revitalization, clean energy initiative, traditional foods and medicine and wellness expertise, and a high-value niche. Nation trading and investment export opportunities such as seaweed, kelp, herring, and fish. If it is done correctly and resources adequately connected, can empower the Coastal First Nations community to forge ahead with a thriving conservation-based economy that everyone can be proud of for the next 7 generations. But we must stay focused. Vision, power, and relationships and innovations are all tools that can be used for successfully changing systems. Is this without any difficulties or adversities? Absolutely not. But we have managed the adversities in our territories for the past 14,000 years. Successful change making is difficult. It involves our communities, our leaders, our children, and trust for a better pathway forward. We must build on our strengths that we all bring into the table. We all have different sources of knowledge. Some may have political, some may have economical, and some may be legal. Every decision we make always includes the children yet unborn, the ones that will one day take our place and carry on and continue this work that we have done. We choose to be change agents, and our work has made a difference to our communities. Our alliance demonstrates that complex issues can be resolved for the greater good of all the territories. Lastly, standing with Indigenous people. Over the years, Indigenous people have stood up and often alone, often criticized, mostly being called protesters, for sharing their deep concern of what is taking place on their territories. We are not protesters, we are protectors. With all the atrocities that have been placed on our people, there still remains a very committed and connected to our territories. It is our inherent right and responsibility to ensure that sustainable initiatives are taking place in all of our territories. While words can be powerful, there are some actions that you can take to support CFN and Indigenous people making transformative change. My CFN colleagues can share with you allyship actions in the chat that you can take and show your support. As we continue to fight the systemic racism, we need allies to stand with us. We need transformative allies, groups and individuals who carry considerable social, political, and economic capital to take the actions, support Indigenous people. Even at the risk of personal loss, transformative allies will use their influence to create a level playing field. They understand that we are at war in an unhealthy and unsustainable system, not with one another. It is when we stand together in collectiveness, lift one another up and practice with compassion, together we are stronger. Each of us must look beyond our own lives and focus on the kind of legacy that we want to leave for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this very comprehensive, inspiring, and powerful statement. I'm very happy to hear about the positive developments you mentioned, especially the recognition of your government in the negotiations with the provincial government of British Columbia for the first time. And I completely agree with you that to conserve natural heritage against so many powerful and sustainable trends we need to be fearless and we need to take risks, for sure. I have a couple of questions to begin with. A few days ago, we heard that some of your communities have been suffering record hot temperatures of almost 50 degrees Celsius, followed by forest fires, some of them out of control. How have you addressed these challenges? How are you planning to adapt to these extreme events that will come in the near future?
Thank you for that question. I really want to recognize the Lytton First Nations and their community. I believe 95% of their community was burnt. They were last week the hottest place in Canada. It reached up to 50 degrees, as you mentioned. And all of our communities, we have never seen, I think it broke records here, not only in BC, but in Canada as well. And the question is really, what can we do to make positive change and stop the damages that are being done? And we look at the resource development that's happening in the world. But also I think it's also about personal. How do we personally, what is our footprint personally? And I think collectively, individually and collectively, we all have a part to play in this. And whether you work in a big corporation or whether you're in an organization or an NGO, you know what, those are the conversations that we've been having for quite some time with these big corporations. What is your footprint and how can we help you get there? And I think in a lot of our Indigenous communities, we have the answers. We have had the answers for many, many, many years. And it's kind of like we say that, what is the word, the translation? The Chicken Little, the sky is falling. We've been telling that for quite some time, that the sky, we know because we see it on our traditional territories. We see the decline on the ocean. We see the impacts firsthand through our Watchman programs. So I think that these are really important that we start listening with an active ear, because our Indigenous communities are right on the land, they're right on the ocean. They know what the impacts that are happening. So I think the onus is on all of us to be an active participant on protecting us.
Yes, I agree. Another point that I'm interested is why do you think are the goals of self-determination and self-sufficiency so critically important to the survival of your people and to the conservation of your ancestral and traditional territories?
I think that's so important because, you know, in a lot of our communities, like we have said, we've had over 14,000 years to fine-tune that ability to protect, enhance, and only take what we need approach. And we spend a lot of time ensuring that our territories and our waters are protected. And we do that through the Watchmen and through the stewardship programs, and we have a Coast Tracker app that each of our communities go out and collect data, collect information so that we can inform our leaders so that they can sit down and have these negotiations. And sometimes, I know in our communities, we are the ones that actually have that information. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans have cut back dramatically, so they don't even have the information. Yet our Indigenous communities, we have the information. We can make big changes in policy, whether it's overfishing on our salmon or harvesting in our forests. So I think that reliance on that knowledge, that traditional knowledge, incorporated with science and incorporated with new innovative approaches like we've done.
Mm-hmm. And how do you manage to hand over the traditional ecological knowledge in the modern context? How do you manage to hand over, to transmit the traditional worldviews, the traditional governance systems that are so critically important for your identity and resilience as Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we do in our community is that we have land use plans, and land use plans are developed by our community. They're developed by the traditional knowledge keepers. They also have input from our elders in our communities. They sometimes bring out the elders to those areas, and the elders talk about the traditional knowledge that they have. For example, in land use plans or marine plans, they say, you can't do anything here. It's because we have clam beds here. It's important that we don't touch this area. This is a no-go for anything, any kind of development. So they really incorporate all of those pieces, and those land use plans go into the government. And that becomes when people are looking at developing in these areas, that becomes the information that they use. And those are collected from our elders and our scientists that they bring in as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now I think we can take a few questions from the participants. I'm receiving a question from Brandon from the UK. He is asking to you, Christine, what is the single most helpful thing that someone in the UK could do to support conservation in your area or in any indigenous community?
Yeah, I know in our area, we have the Great Bear Carbon Credit Corporation, which is, so the Carbon Credit Corporation is where we have our carbon credits and we sell those carbon credits. 97% of all the income that is generated from our sales goes right into our stewardship programs and goes right into the Watchman programs. So there's that way that buying carbon credits always is certainly helpful. But I encourage everybody to sort of look at their Indigenous communities within their area to find out how they can be allyships with them. There's great opportunities. I know that Indigenous communities are always open to sharing and to finding ways that they can be allyships to Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Claire. She's asking to you, what role does tourism play in the new conservation-based economy in your territories?
Sorry, with that first part I didn't hear.
What role does tourism play in the new conservation-based economy of your territories? What is the role of tourism?
Yeah, well, I'll give one of our communities example, Kitasucheche. There once was bear hunting, not from our communities, but external businesses that came in and did bear hunting in their community. And they fought very hard to not allow bear hunting in their community. And in turn, what they've developed is a business that is bear watching, so bear guides. So they would go out and bring people so that they can observe, with that traditional sort of knowledge intact and not disturbing or anything else like that. Those are the types of, in all of our communities, those are the types of opportunities that we're looking. How can we have, do these activities that bring in and generate income, but do it in a way that is sustainable and is not disturbing, because we're all interconnected, whether it's with the bears or the salmon or the eagles. That has always been our value, is not to interfere, but how can we allow other people to experience this?
Excellent. Let's see, another question from Daniela. She's asking, how can your stewardship models become more widely adopted in other regions?
They have expanded in Canada. They have expanded to other areas as well. The one unique thing about our stewardship programs is that, we don't have a cookie cutter approach, because each community is really different. Mm-hmm. And each community identifies what they want to research, what they want to gather, and how they store the information and what they do with the information is different, but we support them. We provide some provide some support so that they can continue to be their own individual communities, research body, and stewardship program. But I think that's what makes it so unique. But it's amazing to watch because all of this information that is coming in, the Coast Tracker app that they have, can also, we do a garbage cleanup on all of our beaches, and they have tracked all the garbage and sometimes can track where exactly it's coming from, what type of garbage is showing up. So it's been so amazing because that's really how you make those change in policies. That's how we make big change in our communities, is we provide the information. And it's really an amazing time for us because we have the information.
Yeah. Let's see, another one. Joan Berneda from Catalonia is concerned about how young communities could actively participate in these kind of efforts, because he says, we are seeing young people going to do voluntary work for many human needs, but not very often for environmental needs, you know. How do you think young people could be involved, could participate in this type of efforts?
Well, I know that with our stewardship programs and our watchman programs, that they do have continuous youth that are joining their teams and learning about all of these pieces, learning how to use the coast trackers, being out in the water. In fact, our beach cleanup, part of the criteria is you have to be youth. But it's not just about cleaning up the beach. It's the teaching that's coming along with that as well. We incorporate making sure that elders are talking about, our responsibility in terms of garbage cleanup and where we're tracking them, where they're coming from. And in our communities as well, I remember my mother and father and grandmothers, they always taught me about this, protecting our environment. It was just part of who we are in our culture, in our ways, in our responsibility to take care of our territories. So the onus is always on us as youth doing that.
Mm-hmm. I see no more questions for the moment, but I have another one, short one, that prompts me. One of your statements you made before is about the stress you made on responsibilities, versus the stress that many Western people, including us, of course, make on rights. Of course, you also are concerned with your rights, with the traditional rights, but you stress very much what are your sacred responsibilities toward your territories, to your ancestors, towards younger generation, and so on and so forth. And I'd like you to comment a little bit about the significance of the responsibility approach for conservation.
Absolutely. Each of our territories, they have what they call hereditary chiefs. And within that system, their hereditary system, within that chieftainship, there are certain pockets of lands that are attached to that chieftainship. So each and everybody in that clan or in that tribe has a responsibility to protect it and make sure that it continues on for the next generation. And I think one of the communities, I know in the northern community, there is a huge LNG that was going to be built on our salmon estuary outside of Prince Rupert. And it was that hereditary chief and all of the people that belong to his tribe that built a house on that island and that put a totem pole on that island, because they said, this is our territory. It is our responsibility to protect it, especially with the salmon. We are not allowing you to build on here. That was his responsibility. His responsibility is to go there and to protect that territory. I think those are sort of good examples of that innate responsibility.
Excellent, excellent. I think this is a very powerful and important message for all of us. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, and I think,
before concluding?
Yes, and I think one of the things that is really important to our Indigenous communities, we do partnerships and we do sit down at tables with government and environmental groups, but the most important thing to remember in our Indigenous communities is that the rights and the responsibility over our territory is our responsibility. So, no longer are the days in which people can come and decide what happens in our territories. Those days are gone. We have very elaborate plans within our community that are very insightful. We have information that nobody else has. So I think that, we just need to understand that those are very important to us, and we don't allow anybody to sort of come in and allow them to have say over our territory. Just because it's a disrespectful thing to do, we have guided these beautiful territories for 14,000 years. I think we got a lot of experience under our belt and we know what we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having it. I really do appreciate it. It's wonderful to meet all of you and all of your listeners. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm really happy and grateful to have shared this conversation with you. Thank you again, once more. I'm now handing over to Kathy to conclude this session.
Thank you so much. I mean, for me to say our huge thanks and appreciation to Christine and to Giuseppe Maria for sharing so much wisdom and experience with us all. And thank you to all of you for your curiosity and your questions. And next Tuesday, in fact, we have a wonderful session that relates to one of the questions that was asked here and can really bring to life, I think, what involving young people right across conservation work, right from the governance and operations to fundraising and storytelling can achieve. And they're going to tell the story of what is going to be the world's first entirely youth-funded nature reserve. So I hope that will be a nice continuation of some of the themes we've talked about here. But once again, thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much, Giuseppe Maria. Please join us then next week and join us also at Fixing the Future in December. And I'm going to leave you with a tiny taste of what that has to offer. Thank you all again and goodbye.
We can feed the world without destroying it. We need to restore the ocean.